Welcome back to Ancient Echoes, where we listen for the voices of the past and trace the stories that shaped the ancient world. I'm Chelsea, and in this episode, we're stepping off the mythic mountaintops and into the living, breathing world of the Greek polis, the city-state. Today, we're exploring the civic soul of ancient Greece, the structure of its society, the clash of ideals between Athens and Sparta, the blood and glory of its wars, the quiet power of its philosophers, and the sacred celebration of its games. From the public square to the battlefield, from the courtroom to the Olympic stadium, this is the world the Greeks built, not just with stone and bronze, but with values, arguments, and sweat. What does it mean to belong to a society? Who gets to speak, to fight, to win, to lead? And when a people define themselves through both reason and war, what kind of legacy does that leave behind? Let's find out. When we hear ancient Greece, our minds often leap to the usual images: philosophers in flowing robes, bronze-clad hoplites marching into battle, maybe a statue or two with perfect abs. But behind the legends and marble facades were real people, living in cities that bustled with trade, rituals, debates, and yes, a fair amount of drama. So, who were the Greeks? Not a single people, not a unified empire. The Greeks referred to themselves as Hellenes, and they lived in a patchwork of independent city-states or polises scattered across the rocky terrain of mainland Greece, the islands of the Aegean, and even the distant shores of Ionia, Sicily, and North Africa. Each polis had its own laws, its own army, its own coins, and very often its own sense of superiority. Think of it like ancient rival universities. Everyone shared a language and some traditions, but you better believe Athens and Sparta would throw down at the metaphorical football game, or the literal one if javelins count. Greek society was deeply hierarchical, and everything revolved around the idea of citizenship, a status that came with both rights and obligations. To be a citizen in most polis, you had to be male, freeborn, of native descent, and often over the age of 18. Citizens had the right to vote in places like Athens, own land, speak in the assembly, and serve in the military. But those rights came with the duty to participate in war, politics, religion, and public life. Citizens weren't just expected to live in the city, they were expected to live for it. Now let's talk about the women. In most city-states, especially Athens, women were excluded from political life. Their world was largely domestic, raising children, managing the household, weaving, and participating in religious rituals. They couldn't vote, couldn't own land in their own name, and were often married young, frequently to much older men. But that's not the whole story. In Sparta, women lived very differently. Spartan girls were educated, trained in physical fitness, and told that their role was to produce strong warriors for the state. They could inherit property, manage estates, and had a level of public presence that their Athenian counterparts could only dream of. So if Athens was more Downton Abbey, Sparta was giving CrossFit matriarch with political influence. Beneath citizens and women in the social pyramid were the slaves, people who had no political rights and were considered property. Slavery was deeply embedded in Greek life. Slaves worked in households, fields, silver mines, and sometimes even alongside artisans. In Athens, there were tens of thousands of enslaved people. Some were war captives, others born into slavery, others foreigners sold into it. It's a harsh and often overlooked truth that the birth of democracy rested in many ways on the shoulders of people who had no voice at all. There were also medics, resident foreigners who lived and worked in the cities but had no citizenship. They could be wealthy, successful, even influential, but never fully Greek in the eyes of the law. Despite their political divisions, the Greeks shared a common language, pantheon of gods, and deep reverence for tradition. Festivals like the Panathenaea in Athens or the Spartan Hyathenaea brought communities together to honor the gods through sacrifice, music, poetry, and public games. Children, especially boys, were educated in reading, writing, music, gymnastics, and rhetoric. The goal wasn't just knowledge, it was to become a well-rounded citizen, someone who could fight for the polis and argue in the agora. In other words, the ideal Greek was part soldier, part philosopher, and part motivational speaker with sandals. So who were the Greeks? They were farmers and merchants, soldiers and slaves, philosophers and potters. They lived in worlds defined by class, gender, and geography, but united by language, religion, and a fiercely competitive spirit. They were people constantly balancing freedom and order, individual glory and communal duty, tradition and innovation. And they built a world where the most important question wasn't just, how do I live, but what do I owe to the city that shapes me? In our next section, we'll visit two very different city-states, Athens and Sparta, and explore how they answered that question in radically different ways. If the ancient Greek world was a stage, then Athens and Sparta were its two brightest stars, forever in tension, forever in contrast. They spoke the same language, worshipped the same gods, and competed in the same Olympic Games. But in nearly every other way, they were living in different worlds. Let's begin with Athens. Athens is often hailed as the cradle of democracy, the home of philosophy, and the birthplace of Western thought. But none of that happened overnight. Early Athens was ruled by aristocrats, noble families who clung to power like ivy on marble columns. But over time, pressures from below forced reform. Leaders like Solon, Cleisthenes, and later Pericles helped build a radical new political system, a direct democracy, where citizens, free, native-born men over 18, could vote, speak, and hold office. And Athenian democracy wasn't just a theory, it was a daily practice. The city buzzed with debate, theater, legal trials, and public festivals. The agora, or the public square, was where philosophy met politics, where merchants sold figs and orators sold ideals. Education was essential. Young Athenian boys studied music, rhetoric, mathematics, and gymnastics. The goal? To cultivate well-rounded citizens, equal parts thinker and warrior. In short, Athenians wanted citizens who could quote Homer, out-argue their uncle in the assembly, and throw a javelin without pulling a muscle. But it wasn't all glory. Remember, only a small fraction of the population were actual citizens. Women were excluded from public life. Slaves and medics, which were those resident foreigners, kept the economic engine running without reaping its rewards. Athens was brilliant, but it wasn't fair. Now let's head south to the Peloponnesus, where life was harder, simpler, and far more militarized. Sparta was a society engineered for war. From the moment a Spartan boy was born, he was evaluated for strength. If he passed, he was raised not by his mother, but by the state. At age 7, he entered the agoge, a brutal military training program designed to shape him into a soldier of absolute discipline, endurance, and loyalty. He would learn to fight, steal, suffer in silence, and follow orders without question. He would sleep in barracks, train in formation, and be whipped for failure, sometimes even for being caught stealing, not for the actual stealing itself. Basically, imagine if middle school was a Navy SEALs boot camp, but with more bronze and fewer hugs. Spartan girls, meanwhile, were trained too, not for war, but for strength. A strong mother, the Spartans believed, made strong sons. And unlike their Athenian sisters, Spartan women could own property, inherit land, and even run households while the men were off at war. Sparta was ruled by 2 kings and a council of elders, with power shared among a rigid social hierarchy. Spartiates, which were full Spartan citizens, born into warrior families. You also had the Perioikoi, which were free non-citizens who handled trade and craftsmanship. The Helots were the enslaved population from conquered peoples, forced to farm and serve the Spartan elite. The Helots vastly outnumbered the Spartiates. Rebellion was always a constant fear, and Spartan society responded with brutal control. So Sparta was stable, but it was built on a foundation of fear. So who got it right? Athens gave us democracy, drama, and Socratic questioning. Sparta gave us discipline, duty, and courage under pressure. Athens created philosophers and poets, while Sparta created warriors who stood firm at Thermopylae, 300 strong against the tide of an empire. There were different answers to the same questions. What does it mean to serve your city? For Athenians, it meant participation, persuasion, and performance. For Spartans, it meant sacrifice, silence, and strength. And when the time came to defend that city, when war threatened not just walls, but ideals, these visions would be put to the ultimate test. Next, we'll step into the fires of war, first united against a common enemy, then tragically divided in a bitter civil struggle. The Persian and the Peloponnesian Wars are next. If Athens and Sparta were rivals in vision, they were briefly united in necessity. In the early 5th century BC, the Greek world faced a threat greater than any internal squabble. From across the Aegean Sea came the sprawling, powerful Persian Empire, with kings who ruled over millions and armies that dwarfed anything the Greeks had ever seen. It was a clash not just of armies, but of ideologies, East against West, empire against freedom, the might of kings against the defiance of citizen soldiers. The conflict began when Athens supported a revolt of Greek cities in Ionia, on the western coast of modern-day Turkey, against Persian rule. King Darius I didn't take kindly to this, so he sent a message in the form of 25,000 troops. The Persians landed at Marathon in 490 BC, expecting an easy victory. What they got instead was a shock. The Athenian hoplites, outnumbered and fighting on their home turf, charged with a boldness no one expected, and they won. Legend says a messenger ran from Marathon to Athens, 26.2 miles, to announce the victory, and then he dropped dead on the spot. So yes, that's why we call it a marathon. And as a marathon runner myself, I like to think I could have made it back, delivered the message, and at least walked it off with a banana and some electrolytes. But Darius wasn't finished, and when his son Xerxes came to power, he launched a full-scale invasion, bringing hundreds of thousands of troops and a fleet to match. In 480 BC, the Greeks stood together, kind of. At Thermopylae, a narrow mountain pass, King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, joined by a few thousand allies, made their legendary last stand. They held the pass for days against impossible odds, giving the other Greek cities time to prepare. It was an act of courage so profound that it still echoes in every underdog story told today. Meanwhile, Athens had evacuated. Their city burned, but their navy, commanded by the clever Themistocles, lured the Persian fleet into the narrow strait of Salamis, and there the tide turned. Greek triremes, which were fast, maneuverable, and deadly, they rammed the larger Persian ships into oblivion. The invasion crumbled. Within a year, the Persians were gone. It was a miracle of coordination. Athens and Sparta, thinkers and fighters working together. And it could have been the start of something lasting. But unity in Greece never stayed long. Within a generation, the old rivalries returned. Athens, flush with victory, began to flex its power. They led the Delian League, which was a network of allied city-states that slowly began to look more like an empire. Tributes became taxes. Allies became subjects. Sparta watched, and eventually, Sparta acted. In 431 BC, the Peloponnesian War broke out. It would last 27 years. It wasn't a war of clean battle lines. It was a war of attrition, of sieges, starvation, disease, and betrayals. Athens built walls and relied on its navy. Sparta invaded its farmland and eventually built a navy of its own, with help from Persia, ironically. At one point, a plague ravaged Athens and killed a third of its population, including Pericles, its most visionary leader. Democracy faltered, factions rose and fell, hope dimmed. The final blow came in 404 BC when Sparta, with the Persian money and military might, defeated Athens at sea and forced its surrender. The war left the Greek world battered and bitter. Athens was no longer an empire. Sparta, now superior, lacked the economic and cultural strength to lead. And across the north, a new power was watching: Macedon. The Greeks had won their freedom from Persia, but they lost it, slowly, painfully, in civil war. Their greatest strength had always been their fierce independence. Their greatest weakness? That they could never quite stop fighting each other. Next, we'll explore another kind of battlefield, one of words, logic, and thought. The philosophers of Greece weren't just thinkers. They were challengers of authority, defenders of truth, and questioners of everything, including war itself. Before professional leagues, before televised halftime shows, and long before anyone sold $12 stadium popcorn, the Greeks had already mastered the idea that sport could be sacred. For the ancient Greeks, athletics weren't just recreation. They were religion, politics, and identity, all wrapped into one laurel wreath. And no event captured this better than the Olympic Games. The first recorded Olympic Games were held in 776 BC in honor of Zeus. These weren't casual tournaments. They were religious festivals held at Olympia, on sacred ground near the massive temple of Zeus. The games took place every 4 years, a period called an Olympiad, and during that time, something extraordinary happened. The Greek world declared a sacred truce. City-states at war would lay down their arms so athletes, spectators, and officials could travel and compete safely. Imagine a ceasefire between Athens and Sparta, not for diplomacy, but for discus. The original Olympics featured events that reflected the values of the warrior class. There were no team sports, no medals, no consolation prizes. Only victory mattered, and victory meant eternal fame. Some of the events included the Stadion, which is a 200-meter sprint, and it's the oldest Olympic event. Wrestling and boxing, which was a test of strength and technique. The Pankration, which is a brutal, no-holds-barred blend of boxing and wrestling. So kind of think of it as the UFC meets divine endurance. The pentathlon, which is a combo of discus, javelin, long jump, foot race, and wrestling. It's essentially the ultimate war game. And the chariot race, for the elite, with teams of horses and often very dramatic finishes. All competitors were male, and all competed nude. Yes, nude. This wasn't scandalous in Greek society, it was symbolic. Competing naked showed physical perfection and honored the gods. It was a tribute of form and function. Winners didn't get gold medals, they got a simple olive wreath. But what they really won was something more lasting: kalos, or glory. A victorious athlete returned home a hero. Cities might reward them with feasts, front row seats at the theater, free meals for life, or even a statue in the public square. Their name would be etched into Olympic history and into the pride of their polis. Athletics, like war, was a stage for excellence, a chance to prove yourself not just to your peers, but to the gods. And unlike war, if you lost, you got bruised pride, not a spear in the ribs, most of the time. Physical training was a civic duty for male citizens. The gymnasion, where we get the word gymnasium, was a hub for both athletic and intellectual life. Philosophers might be debating under one portico, while young men trained under another. In Athens, it was part of becoming a complete citizen, mind and body in harmony. In Sparta, of course, it was survival. Every boy's life was training. And for both, athleticism was a reflection of arete, the Greek ideal of excellence in all things. It's easy to see the ancient Olympics as a prototype for modern ones, but in truth, they were something different, something deeper. Sport wasn't a sideshow, it was sacred, it was political, it was identity. And perhaps most importantly, it was one of the few places where city-states gathered in peace, where competition didn't mean annihilation, and where the highest ideal wasn't domination, but excellence. Next, we'll leave the stadium and enter the academy. From Socrates to Plato to Aristotle, we'll explore how philosophy shaped and sometimes challenged the values of Greek society itself. Let's leave behind the clang of swords and the roar of stadiums. We're stepping into something quieter now, though no less powerful. The Greek world wasn't just obsessed with the strength of the body or the defense of the city. It also became the birthplace of critical thought, moral inquiry, and the dangerous art of asking questions no one wanted answered. This is the world of philosophy, where words could wound, ideas could inspire revolutions, and one question could shake an empire. We begin with Socrates, a man who left no writings of his own, but left behind a legacy so powerful it still shapes classrooms today. He wandered the streets of Athens barefoot, engaging anyone and everyone in conversation. But he wasn't lecturing, he was questioning, relentlessly. What is justice? What is virtue? What does it mean to live a good life? He used a method now known as the Socratic method, a form of cooperative dialogue based on asking and answering questions to stimulate critical thinking. To many, he was a nuisance, a gadfly, he called himself, stinging the lazy horse of Athens to keep it awake. To his students, like Plato, he was a visionary. To the Athenian state, he became a threat. In 399 BC, after the Peloponnesian War and a brief period of political instability, Socrates was put on trial for corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. He was found guilty and sentenced to death, and he drank the hemlock with calm resolve, choosing death over silence, a philosopher's martyrdom. Plato, Socrates' student, was deeply shaken by his teacher's death, and it shaped everything he wrote. He founded the Academy, one of the first formal institutions of higher learning in the Western world. His writings took the form of dialogues, often featuring Socrates as the central voice. Plato believed the world we see is only a shadow of the true reality, a realm of perfect forms, ideal versions of justice, beauty, and goodness. The physical world, he said, was fleeting. True knowledge came through reason and philosophical reflection. If you've ever felt like there's something more beyond the surface, that beauty or truth is out there in some higher form, you're already thinking like Plato. And then came Aristotle, Plato's student and tutor to a young man named Alexander the Great. Aristotle took a different path. While Plato looked upward to ideals, Aristotle looked outward to the natural world. He studied biology, ethics, politics, drama, and logic. He believed in observing, classifying, and building systems. He asked questions like, what makes a good life? What is the purpose of the state? How should a tragedy be written? He believed virtue lay in the golden mean, not in extremes, but in balanced action. His work laid the groundwork for everything from scientific inquiry to constitutional theory. Together, these three philosophers represent the soul of Greek intellectual tradition. Where other cultures told people what to think, the Greeks asked, why? Why does the state exist? What is justice? What do we owe to each other? Can truth be known or only pursued? These are not just some abstract puzzles. These were civic questions. In a world defined by politics, war, and public life, philosophy was the inner counterbalance, a mirror held up to power, a lantern carried into darkness. And while Greece would eventually fall to Macedon, to Rome, to time, it is this inner legacy that endures. Not just the temples or the plays or the sculptures, but the idea that the best societies aren't those that claim to know all the answers. They're the ones brave enough to ask the hardest questions. Next, we'll bring it all together, city, shield, soul, and sport, and ask what the Greeks were truly fighting for, and why their echoes still reach us today. So what does it mean to belong to a society like ancient Greece? A world where boys trained with swords and words, where cities rose and fell over ideals, and where excellence wasn't just celebrated, it was sacred. In this episode, we've walked through the agora and into the gymnasium. We've stood shoulder to shoulder with hoplites at Marathon and Spartans at Thermopylae. We've listened to Socrates challenge a student in the shade of an olive tree, and we've watched an athlete run for glory beneath the blazing sun at Olympia. And through it all, we've seen one question repeat itself over and over again. What does it mean to live well? For yourself and for your city. For the Greeks, life was a balancing act between the polis and the person, between discipline and debate, between physical might and philosophical clarity. They weren't perfect. Their society excluded far more than it included. Their wars were often self-destructive. Their politics could be chaotic, but their pursuit of excellence, their reverence for beauty, and their willingness to ask hard questions, those things still echo today. We are, in many ways, still living in their contradictions, still asking their questions, still trying to become what they call kalos kagathos, a person who is both noble in spirit and excellent in action. Thanks for joining me on this journey through ancient Greek society on Ancient Echoes. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing it with a friend who loves history, and be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. Next time, we'll step into the world of epic poetry, mythic memory, and heroic rage, as we turn to the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Until then, may your thoughts be sharp, your steps steady, and your questions unafraid.